They were led down a quiet street, past open windows and warm lights, toward a front door that stood open instead of locked. And in that simple, ordinary moment, something inside them stopped, because this was not a camp, not a fence, not a barracks, and not a controlled space, but a civilian home, a private world they were never supposed to enter. And as they stood at the doorway, neither guards nor orders mattered anymore. Only the question that formed silently in their minds: what kind of place invites prisoners inside? And what happens to a man when captivity suddenly looks like hospitality instead of control? The house did not look like anything they associated with captivity. And that was the first thing that unsettled them, because there were no fences, no watchtowers, no commands, and no visible symbols of control. Only a small wooden porch, warm light coming from inside, and a door that stood open in a way that felt unnatural to men who had learned to read every space as a structure of authority. And this simple visual contradiction immediately disrupted the internal logic they carried about, where they belonged and where they did not. They stopped before crossing the threshold, not because anyone told them to, and not because fear physically held them back, but because the mind hesitates when it cannot categorize a space, and this space did not fit any category they understood, because it was not a military building, not a camp structure, and not a controlled environment, but a private home, a place defined by intimacy, routine, and personal life. And those meanings do not coexist easily with the identity of a prisoner. The doorway itself became a psychological boundary, not a physical one, because nothing blocked their movement and no force restrained their bodies. Yet their minds refused to move forward, because the self is shaped by permission as much as by restriction. And when permission appears without structure, the mind does not know how to respond to it, because it has learned to function inside systems of command, not inside systems of invitation. They became acutely aware of their own presence, of their clothing, of their posture, of the dust on their jackets, of the dirt on their shoes, because the contrast between their condition and the environment in front of them created a sudden internal self-awareness, a feeling of being out of place, not in space, but an identity, because they were not guests, not civilians, not neighbors, and not members of this world, and yet they were being invited into it. The sounds coming from inside the house did not feel threatening, but unfamiliar in a different way. Voices, quiet movement, the rhythm of domestic life, and the ordinary noise of people existing inside their own private space. And this ordinariness felt more destabilizing than hostility, because hostility confirms identity, while hospitality dissolves it. And when identity begins to dissolve, the mind loses its structure. They did not feel fear in the traditional sense, but a form of psychological paralysis, because the mind had no script for this moment, no learned response, no internal pattern to follow, since nothing in their experience had prepared them for being invited into the private world of civilians. And when the mind lacks a script, it freezes, because freezing is safer than choosing the wrong action. Time seemed to slow in that space between the porch and the doorway, not because the moment was dramatic, but because it was undefined, and undefined moments stretch psychologically, because the mind cannot move forward without meaning, and meaning had not yet formed. And in that pause, their identities as prisoners, soldiers, and outsiders collided with the reality in front of them, creating a quiet internal tension that did not express itself as emotion, but as stillness. They were standing in a place where no rule applied clearly, where no structure dictated behavior, and where no authority signaled the correct response. And this absence of structure was more destabilizing than any form of control, because control at least gives direction, while openness creates uncertainty, and uncertainty forces the mind to confront itself. This was not a moment of comfort, and not a moment of kindness in the simple sense, but a moment of psychological displacement, where they no longer felt anchored in the identity of prisoners, but did not yet belong to any other identity either. And this in-between state created a silent internal conflict, because the self cannot exist easily without a clear role. The house did not feel like freedom, and it did not feel like captivity, but like something in between, a space where the boundaries of their existence no longer made sense. And this confusion was the first stage of a deeper transformation, because when the mind is placed in a reality it cannot categorize, it must either reject it or adapt to it. And in that quiet pause at the doorway, adaptation began not as a decision, but as a psychological necessity. They had not yet stepped inside, but the crossing had already begun, not of a physical threshold, but of a mental one. Because once the mind accepts that a prisoner could be invited into a home, the old structure of enemy, civilian, and captive begins to lose its clarity. And when that clarity fades, identity begins to shift. And that shift began here, in front of a door that did not feel real, because it belonged to a world they were never meant to enter. When they crossed the threshold, the first feeling was not comfort and not relief, but a deep psychological disorientation, because the inside of the house did not feel hostile and did not feel controlled. And yet it did not feel safe either, because nothing in their experience had prepared them to exist inside a civilian space that carried no signs of authority, no visible rules, and no clear structure of power. And this absence of structure created a silent internal confusion where the mind did not know how to position itself. Every detail inside the house felt loaded with meaning, not because the objects were important, but because they belonged to a world of normal life they no longer understood how to enter. And this created a constant internal tension, because the mind of a prisoner is trained to read environments through control and restriction, not through openness and invitation. And when openness appears, the mind loses its internal map of behavior and response. They became aware of their own presence in a new way, of their worn clothes, their posture, and the contrast between their condition and the cleanliness of the space around them. And this contrast created a quiet sense of separation, because difference signals non-belonging, and non-belonging reshapes identity from the inside, not through rejection, but through internal withdrawal. They did not feel fear, but they did not feel ease either, because ease requires familiarity, and familiarity had been erased by years of captivity, and this unfamiliarity turned every movement into hesitation, every gesture into uncertainty, and every action into a mental calculation, because the mind no longer knew what behavior was appropriate in a world that did not treat them as prisoners. The atmosphere inside the house carried no threat, no commands, and no visible control. But this absence did not create calm, because captivity teaches the mind to function under pressure, not under freedom. And when freedom appears without structure, the mind experiences it as instability rather than safety. They existed in a suspended psychological state, where they were physically inside the space, but mentally still outside it, because identity had not crossed the threshold even though the body had. And this separation between body and identity created a quiet internal strain that did not express itself as emotion, but as stillness. The longer they remained, the more the space began to feel unreal, not because it was strange, but because it was too normal. And normality belongs to a life that moves forward, and their lives no longer moved in that way. And this contrast created a deep internal dissonance between a world that continued and a self that felt suspended. They were not experiencing kindness as kindness, but as contradiction, because the mind was being placed inside a reality that did not match its identity. And when identity and reality no longer align, the self begins to change, not through decision, but through psychological necessity. They had entered a home, but they had not entered belonging, because belonging is not created by space, but by identity, and their identity no longer fit inside normal life. And this misalignment marked the true beginning of transformation, where the mind started to release the old structure that defined who they were, not through force, but through quiet exposure to a world they were never meant to be part of. As the moment inside the house continued, something subtle began to change within them, not in their surroundings and not in the people around them, but in the way they felt themselves existing inside the world, because the mind cannot remain inside a reality that does not recognize its identity without reshaping that identity from the inside. And this reshaping does not happen through collapse or shock, but through quiet internal adjustment. They started to feel less defined by the role of prisoner and not yet able to feel like civilians. And this in-between state created a silent psychological tension, because the human mind depends on clear roles to remain stable. And when roles dissolve, the self begins to lose its internal structure, not dramatically, but gradually, as if its edges were becoming softer and less defined. Their reactions became slower, not because they were calm, but because their inner world had begun to withdraw from intensity, because intensity requires meaning, and meaning had started to feel unstable. And when meaning becomes unstable, the mind reduces emotional engagement as a form of protection, choosing distance instead of depth and observation instead of participation. They no longer experience the environment as something happening to them, but as something happening around them, because psychological distance had begun to grow between their awareness and their emotions. And this distance created a quiet internal separation where experience no longer felt personal, but external, as if they were present in their bodies but absent in their identities. Their memories of who they had been before captivity began to feel less connected to who they were becoming, not because they were forgotten, but because they no longer felt relevant to the reality they were now living in. And this disconnection created a subtle identity fracture, where the past felt distant, the present felt suspended, and the future felt undefined. They were no longer preparing themselves mentally for punishment, and no longer bracing for control, and no longer expecting hostility, because the environment did not demand those responses. And when survival patterns disappear, identity changes with them, because identity is built on response, and response is built on threat, and threat was no longer shaping their inner world. A quiet emotional neutrality began to form, not peace and not comfort, but a flattening of inner experience, where feelings became softer, reactions became smaller, and psychological movement slowed, because the mind had chosen stability over struggle and adaptation over resistance. They were still aware, still thinking, and still present, but in a reduced way, because the self had begun to contract in order to survive inside a reality that no longer made sense. And this contraction reshaped their inner life into something quieter, less defined, and less resistant. This was not a moment of transformation that could be seen from the outside, because nothing visible had changed, but internally a shift had begun, where the mind was slowly letting go of the structure that once defined who they were, not through force, but through psychological necessity. And this shift marked the beginning of a deeper change, where identity would no longer be built on captivity or opposition, but on adaptation and emotional distance. They were still standing inside the house, still present in the room, and still surrounded by normal life. But psychologically, they had already begun to move away from the old version of themselves. Because once the mind stops recognizing its place in the world, it begins to rebuild itself in silence. And that rebuilding had quietly begun. As this inner shift continued, their sense of time itself began to change, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet and gradual one, because time no longer felt like movement towards something, but like a series of moments without direction. And when direction disappears, The mind loses one of its main structures for meaning, because meaning depends on progression, and progression depends on a future that feels reachable. They began to experience the present as a closed space, not connected clearly to the past, and not opening naturally toward the future. And this created a psychological compression of time, where existence became focused on what was immediately happening rather than what was coming next, because the mind no longer knew how to project itself forward into a world that felt distant and uncertain. The idea of later started to lose its emotional weight, not because they no longer cared about the future, but because the future no longer felt real enough to organize their inner lives around it. And when the future loses reality, the present becomes the only psychological anchor, even if that present feels empty, repetitive, and emotionally thin. Their memories also began to change their texture, not disappearing, but losing their emotional force because memory needs connection to remain alive, and that connection had weakened, and the past started to feel less like personal history and more like a distant narrative that belonged to another version of themselves, someone who no longer fully existed in their current identity. This flattening of time created a quiet internal stillness, where urgency faded, pressure dissolved, and inner movement slowed, not because their situation had improved, but because the mind had adapted by reducing its sense of temporal depth, choosing psychological stability over emotional intensity. They began to live more inside routines than inside intentions, more inside repetition than inside purpose, because routines provide structure without demanding meaning, and meaning had become too heavy to sustain, and this shift made daily life feel predictable, manageable, and psychologically safe, even as it became emotionally empty. The world outside the house, the world beyond the camp, and the world described in newspapers and stories began to feel abstract and distant, like a parallel reality that existed somewhere else, but no longer touched their inner lives directly. Because when time inside the self flattens, everything outside begins to feel far away. They were still physically present in their environment, still moving, still acting, and still responding, but psychologically they were beginning to exist in a smaller inner world, one that was organized around containment rather than expansion, and stability rather than growth, because growth requires belief in a future, and belief in the future had begun to weaken. This was not despair and not surrender, but a form of quiet adaptation, where the mind simplified its relationship with time in order to survive, reducing complexity, reducing expectation, and reducing emotional reach, because complexity had become exhausting to carry. By this stage, captivity no longer felt defined only by space, but by time itself, because when time loses direction, existence becomes static, and when existence becomes static, identity stops evolving and begins to settle into a quiet psychological stillness that feels stable, contained, and emotionally neutral. And in that stillness, the self learns how to exist without forward movement, without urgency, and without the internal pressure to become something else. They were still inside a human world, still surrounded by life, and still aware of reality. But psychologically, they were beginning to live in a state where time no longer pushed them forward, and meaning no longer pulled them ahead, and that flattening of time became another invisible layer of captivity, not imposed by walls or rules, but by the quiet restructuring of the mind itself. By the time this internal process reached its final stage, the struggle that once shaped their inner lives no longer felt active, not because it had been resolved, but because it had slowly lost its function. And when struggle loses its function, it does not transform into peace, it transforms into stillness, because the mind no longer knows what it is supposed to push against. They no longer experience their situation as something that demanded resistance, because resistance requires a clear sense of injustice. And injustice requires emotional contrast. And that contrast had begun to fade, replaced by a psychological environment that felt stable, predictable, and emotionally flat. And this flatness did not feel comforting, but familiar, because familiarity reduces internal tension, even when meaning is absent. Hope did not disappear suddenly, but changed its shape quietly, because hope depends on a future that feels different from the present, and the present no longer felt unbearable enough to require a different future. And when the present becomes tolerable, the mind stops projecting itself forward and begins to settle where it is, not out of contentment, but out of adaptation. Their inner world reorganized around routine rather than purpose, around repetition rather than meaning, and around psychological safety rather than freedom. Because safety reduces internal conflict, and when conflict disappears, the energy for change disappears with it. And this loss did not feel like surrender, but like calm, a calm without fulfillment, a calm without joy, and a calm without direction. The memory of who they had been before captivity began to feel distant, not painful, but detached, as if it belonged to another person, because identity adapts to the environment it lives in, and over time the environment becomes the main reference point for the self. And when that happens, the old identity fades quietly without resistance. They were no longer defined by who they had been, and not yet defined by who they would become, but existed in a suspended psychological state where identity had no clear direction, no strong narrative, and no emotional anchor. And this suspension did not feel chaotic, but empty, because emptiness requires less energy to maintain than inner conflict. This was the quiet end of resistance, not marked by collapse, not marked by breakdown, and not marked by visible defeat, but by psychological accommodation, where the mind no longer opposed the system, no longer questioned it, and no longer tried to change it, but learned to exist inside it with minimal internal friction. They had not been broken by violence, and they had not been crushed by fear, and they had not been destroyed by suffering, but they had been reshaped by normalization, by routine, and by the slow internal restructuring of meaning, where captivity stopped being defined by walls and started being defined by perception. By the end of this process, captivity no longer needed to assert itself because it had become internal. And when captivity becomes internal, it no longer feels like a prison, it feels like reality. And when reality feels normal, resistance does not disappear through force, but through quiet adaptation, where the self learns how to remain still, how to exist without forward movement, and how to survive not by fighting, but by becoming silent inside itself. When they finally stepped back outside, nothing in the physical world had changed because the camp was still there, the rules were still there, and captivity still existed exactly as it had before, and yet something inside them had shifted in a way that could not be reversed because the true change had not happened in the house, but in their perception of themselves inside the world. The invitation had not given them freedom, and it had not given them belonging, but it had shown them a reality they could not enter, a normal life they could not participate in, and a world that continued without them. And that realization quietly reshaped how they understood their place in existence. Because the most powerful transformations are not created by violence, but by awareness. What remained was not anger, not rebellion, and not despair, but a silent internal distance, where captivity stopped being defined by fences and guards and started being defined by perception, time, and psychological separation from normal life itself. And in the end, the door they stood in front of did not become a path to freedom, but became a mirror, reflecting a truth they could not escape, that captivity is not only a place, but a state of mind. And once the mind accepts that state, the prison no longer needs walls to exist, because it continues quietly, invisibly inside the self. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.